Imagine this, a spoiled city boy and a hard-working farm girl forced into an unlikely marriage just to fulfill a cunning plan. At first, it's all resentment and schemes, but soon they'll discover something that neither of them ever expected, a chance to rewrite their lives together. Betrayal, transformation, and a love that grows against all odds. This story will keep you on the edge of your seat. But before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. You will marry Emily Carter, or you will lose everything. The words hit like a hammer, reverberating through the grand dining hall. Harold Kane, a man of unyielding resolve, stood tall at the head of the table, his cold, piercing gaze locked onto his sons, the unspoken weight of his ultimatum suffocating the room. Even the ticking of the antique grandfather clock seemed to pause in anticipation. Lucas Kane's jaw tightened, anger flaring in his chest. "You can't be serious, father," he said, his voice rising as he slammed his palms on the polished mahogany table. "You're asking me to marry a farmer? A nobody?" Harold's face remained unmoved, a monument to resolve. "I'm not asking, Lucas. I'm telling you. Emily Carter will be your wife, or you'll leave this house with nothing but your name." His tone was as cold as the marble floors beneath them. Lucas's laugh was bitter, sharp. "This is just another one of your games, isn't it? Manipulating me like I'm one of your corporate pawns. Well, it won't work." His voice cracked, frustration slipping through the cracks of his defiance. Harold's expression didn't waver. If anything, his words grew heavier, more deliberate. "You've wasted your life coasting on my fortune, Lucas. The cars, the parties, the deals you never earned. This marriage is your chance to understand loyalty, commitment, things you clearly lack." The tension in the room thickened, the air seemingly drained of warmth. The Kane mansion, with its vaulted ceilings and glittering chandeliers, seemed almost complicit in the magenta backdrop of opulence that underscored Lucas's life of privilege. The dining table, expansive enough to seat a small army, gleamed like a stage for a battle of wills. Meanwhile, miles away, Emily Carter stood on the edge of her family's farm, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her world was a stark contrast to the Kane estate. The land was tired, dotted with wilting crops and weathered fences. The farmhouse, though humble and worn, held a quiet, enduring charm. Inside, the scent of lavender mingled with freshly baked bread, a small comfort in the shadow of looming debt. Emily wiped her hands on her overalls, her fingers calloused and dirt-streaked, a testament to years of toil. She gazed out over the fields, her heart heavy but determined. Each day brought a fresh battle against the weather, the bills, the odds stacked against her family. And now, this arrangement. She hadn't agreed to Harold Kane's proposition lightly, but saving her farm meant more than pride, it was survival. Back at the mansion, Harold Kane stood as a figure of contradictions. To the world, he was a titan of industry, revered for his sharp intellect and steely resolve. But to those who knew him, he was a man haunted by past mistakes. His calculated decisions often left devastation in their wake. But this time, he told himself, it was different. This was for Lucas, for the future. And yet Lucas Kane couldn't see it. The very embodiment of privilege, Lucas wore his entitlement like an expensive suit tailored perfectly but hollow beneath. His smirk, his bravado, his devil-may-care attitude masked something deeper, a hunger for his father's approval buried under years of unmet expectations. Emily Carter, on the other hand, was a study in quiet strength. Her resilience wasn't born of wealth or privilege, but of necessity. She'd learned to find beauty in simplicity, the sun rising over the fields, the scent of rain on dry earth. But her eyes, so steady and kind, carried the weight of unspoken struggles. "Fine," Lucas said finally, his voice taut with defiance. "If this is the game you want to play, I'll marry her. But don't think for a second I'll forgive you for this." He pushed back his chair and stormed out, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him. For the first time, Harold's facade cracked. Alone in the grand dining hall, his shoulders sagged slightly, his steely resolve dulled by a shadow of doubt. "One day you'll understand," he muttered. But the words rang hollow, even to him. Emily stood by the fence, staring at the distant horizon. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the fields. She didn't know Lucas Kane beyond the headlines and whispers of his reckless escapades. Yet here she was, about to tie her life to his in a union built not on love, but necessity. She didn't trust Harold Kane's motives, but she trusted her own. This marriage would save her family's farm. Whatever came next, she'd face it head on. Lucas's sleek black car screeched to a halt at the edge of the farm's dirt road. Dust swirled around the car, clinging to its polished surface. He stepped out, brushing dirt from his suit with a look of disgust. Before him lay the Carter farm fields that stretched in uneven rows, a modest farmhouse, and a life he couldn't begin to fathom. This isn't just exile, Lucas muttered to himself, his tone edged with resentment. This is a punishment. The house was a testament to time and neglect. Peeling paint curled off the wooden siding, the porch slouched like an exhausted soldier, and the rusted swing groaned with the slightest breeze. Lucas Kane stepped out of his car, his polished shoes sinking into the gravel driveway. He scanned the scene, his lips pressing into a thin line. A broken-down tractor leaned against the barn, its rusted frame overgrown with weeds. He shook his head, muttering, "What a joke." From the porch, Emily Carter stepped into view, wiping her hands on a flour-streaked apron. Her sharp eyes took him in from head to toe, the crisp lines of his tailored suit, the pristine shoes already dusted with farm dirt. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. This was Harold Kane's solution? "You're late," Emily said, crossing her arms over her chest. Her voice was steady, carrying an edge of authority that didn't quite mask her annoyance. "I've been waiting since sunrise." Lucas arched an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth curling into a smirk. "Trust me, I thought about not coming at all," he replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But here I am." "Lucky you." Emily's gaze didn't waver, though her lips tightened. She stepped off the porch, the creak of the wood punctuating the silence between them. "Well," she said flatly, "if you were expecting a red carpet, you've come to the wrong place. We've got work to do." Lucas laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Work? That's adorable. Let's get one thing straight, I'm not here to play farmer. I'm here because I don't have a choice." Emily didn't flinch. Her eyes locked onto his with a quiet intensity. "Funny," she said coolly. "Neither do I. So, if you're done whining, we can get started." The inside of the farmhouse wasn't much better. The living room smelled faintly of lavender, underscored by the earthy scent of livestock. The furniture was a mismatched collection of worn cushions and sagging springs. The faded curtains filtered weak sunlight onto floors that groaned under Lucas's every step. Family photos lined the walls, their sepia tones whispering of lives lived far removed from his world of luxury. Lucas turned away, finding the rustic charm stifling. Emily handed him a sheet of paper, her fingers brushing his as she did. "Here's your list," she said briskly. "Chores are non-negotiable. I don't care how many zeros are in your bank account." Lucas scanned the list, his jaw tightening as he read. "Feed the chickens, fix the barn door, weed the garden." He looked up at her, disbelief etched across his face. "This has to be a joke. I have an MBA, not a pair of overalls." Emily's lips curved into the faintest smirk. "Then consider this a masterclass in humility," she said, turning on her heel. "Welcome to the syllabus." The sun rose over the farm, casting a golden glow on the fields. To Lucas, it was just another miserable morning. The rooster's crow pierced his restless sleep, and he groaned, burying his face in the lumpy pillow. A sharp knock at the door jolted him upright. "Get up!" Emily's voice called through the hallway. "The cows aren't going to milk themselves." He muttered a string of curses as he dragged himself out of bed. He glanced at the list Emily had given him, now crumpled on the bedside table. His eyes lingered on the words, "Feed the chickens." His lips twisted into a grimace. Perfect. Death by poultry. By the time he stumbled into the yard, Emily was already hard at work. She moved with precision and ease, lifting heavy buckets as though they were weightless. Lucas hesitated, watching her for a moment before she turned, catching his gaze. "Chickens," she said simply, pointing to the coop with her chin. "Water and feed. Think you can handle that?" Lucas rolled his eyes but held his tongue. Grabbing the bucket, he trudged toward the coop, muttering under his breath. The chickens squawked and flapped their wings as he approached, their beady eyes glaring up at him. One particularly aggressive hen lunged, sending him stumbling back with a startled yelp. "What is this, Jurassic Park?" he muttered, cautiously dumping the feed into the trough. He flinched as feathers flew into the air, narrowly avoiding a second attack from the same hen. From a distance, Emily smirked as she watched Lucas's battle with the chickens. "Welcome to the farm," she called over her shoulder, her voice laced with amusement. "It only gets harder from here." From across the yard, Emily watched Lucas flinch as a particularly feisty chicken lunged at him. Amusement flickered across her face despite her exasperation. "They're chickens, Lucas, not velociraptors," she called out. "Easy for you to say," he shot back, narrowly dodging another flurry of wings. "I'm pretty sure that one's plotting my demise." Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type fruit if you've made it this far. Only those who get this far will understand. Now, let's get back to the story. Emily chuckled softly, but didn't linger. The broken fence near the pasture demanded her attention. As she worked, her mind drifted back to Lucas. He was out of his depth, drowning in the reality of her world. She wasn't sure whether to pity him or let him sink. By midday, Lucas was drenched in sweat, his once pristine shirt smeared with dirt and hanging limp from his shoulders. Emily approached him with a fresh task, a hammer and a box of nails in her hands. "Fence repair," she said simply, holding them out to him. Lucas groaned, swiping at the dirt, streaking his forehead. "Why not just call a handyman?" Emily's brow arched. "Handymen cost money, and around here, we do things ourselves. Unless you want the cows wandering into town, you'd better get to it." As Lucas wrestled with the stubborn boards of the fence, he couldn't help but steal glances at Emily. She worked tirelessly, her movements fluid and efficient. She didn't complain, even when her tasks demanded more than most could give. There was something maddeningly admirable about her, though he'd never admit it, not yet. The barn was cool in the late afternoon, its faded red walls casting long shadows. Lucas leaned against a beam, catching his breath. His hands were raw, his body aching in ways he'd never experienced. He reached for a water bottle, letting his gaze wander over the cluttered interior. A stack of weathered crates in the corner caught his attention. One tilted slightly, as though concealing something beneath it. Driven more by boredom than curiosity, Lucas crossed the barn and pushed the crate aside. The loose floorboard it hid came free with little effort, revealing a stack of papers bound by twine. He pulled them out, brushing off years of dust. The bold, confident script on the top letter stopped him cold. It was unmistakably his father's handwriting. His pulse quickened as he unfolded the first letter. It detailed land acquisition scold, clinical transactions with names and figures. The second was worse. Lucas's stomach churned as he read about how Harold Kane had pressured the Carters into selling off land piece by piece. The final letter shattered any lingering illusions. Its message was stark and unapologetic. The marriage is a necessary step to secure our interests. Once Lucas is in place, we can proceed with acquiring the remaining land. The paper slipped from Lucas's hands as a wave of nausea rolled through him. His father's scheme had nothing to do with lessons or growth. It was about power, about control. Harold hadn't just manipulated him. He'd preyed on Emily's desperation, her family's suffering. Lucas stormed out of the barn, the letters clenched in his fist. He found Emily by the garden, dirt staining her hands as she pulled weeds. She looked up, startled by the flush in his face and the tremble in his hands. "Did you know about this?" he demanded, shoving the papers toward her. His voice cracked under the weight of his anger. "Did you know my father is the reason your family lost everything?" Emily took the papers, her confusion giving way to disbelief as she read. Her grip tightened, the pages trembling slightly. When she finally looked up, her eyes were a mixture of hurt and anger. "I didn't know," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Not like this." She sank onto the edge of the porch, the letters still clutched in her hands. Lucas paced in front of her, his frustration boiling over. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice raw. "He told me this was about teaching me responsibility, about earning my place. I thought." He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I thought he was doing this for me." Emily's gaze sharpened. "For you?" she snapped, her voice trembling. "Do you have any idea what we've been through? What my parents endured? This wasn't about you, Lucas. It never was." Her words hit him like a slap. He didn't defend himself, he couldn't. "I didn't know," he said, softly. "Emily, I swear I didn't know. I didn't know he gestured to the letters, that he could be this cruel." Emily let out a shaky breath, the anger in her eyes dimming just slightly. She folded the letters carefully, placing them beside her on the step. "What do we do now?" she asked. her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas hesitated. His whole life, he'd relied on his father's wealth and influence, but now that felt like a crutch he could no longer lean on. For the first time, he felt a weight of responsibility, real responsibility. "We fight back," he said, his voice steady for the first time that day. "We won't let him take this farm. Not this time." Emily studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of insincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Then we start now." Emily raised an eyebrow. Skepticism etched across her face. "And how exactly do we fight him? Your father has more money, lawyers, and power than we could ever hope to match. All we have are broken tools, a failing farm, and a mountain of debt." Lucas sat beside her, the determination in his eyes unyielding. "Then we start with what we have," he said firmly. "This farm isn't just land to him, it's leverage. If we can make it self-sufficient, if we can turn it around, he loses his hold on you, on us." Emily studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his. "You're serious?" Lucas nodded, his voice steady. "I am." A faint, incredulous smile tugged at her lips despite herself. "You're a city boy with soft hands and a big mouth. What do you know about fixing a farm?" "Not much," Lucas admitted, a wry grin breaking through his determination. The words hung in the air, tentative but promising. For the first time since their forced marriage, they weren't adversaries. They were allies. The weeks that followed tested them both in ways neither could have predicted. Lucas worked harder than he ever thought possible, his once pristine hands blistered and rough from labor. Together, he and Emily repaired fences, replanted fields, and worked late into the night strategizing ways to make the farm profitable again. The tension that had once defined their relationship softened, replaced by a growing camaraderie. But Emily carried a weight she hadn't shared with Lucas, a secret that gnawed at her during quiet moments. One evening, as the sky burned with the colors of sunset, she sat alone on the porch, her hands clutching a worn photograph of her parents. Their faces beamed with pride and determination, a reflection of the better days before betrayal and loss had taken their toll. Lucas stepped out of the house, wiping dirt from his hands, his brow furrowed as he noticed her silence and the photograph in her hands. "Your family?" he asked, leaning against the porch railing. Emily nodded, her fingers tracing the edges of the picture. "My parents. This farm was their dream. They fought so hard to keep it when things started going wrong, but..." Her voice faltered. "But Harold didn't leave them a choice." Lucas winced, the reminder of his father's cruelty hitting harder with each repetition. "You've mentioned that before," he said gently, "but I feel like there's more to it than that." Emily hesitated, her jaw tightening. Finally she exhaled, her voice quieter than usual. "There is." Lucas blinked, startled. "Your uncle?" Emily nodded, her face clouded with pain. "He convinced them it was a great deal, but it wasn't. He forged documents, pocketed most of the money, and disappeared. By the time my parents realized, it was too late. They were drowning in debt, and Harold swept in, pretending to be their savior. But he was just another predator." Lucas stared at her, anger and sympathy swirling in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because it doesn't change anything," Emily said, her voice wavering. "The farm is still in danger. Your father is still coming for it." Lucas crouched beside her, his voice low but resolute. "It changes everything, Emily. Your family didn't fail, they were betrayed. And if Harold thinks he can use that to crush you, he's dead wrong." Her eyes met his, a flicker of hope breaking through her despair. For the first time, she felt the strength of their alliance solidify. They weren't just fighting for the farm anymore. They were fighting for justice and for each other. The first strike in Harold Kane's retaliation came on a crisp morning. The farm, once chaotic and broken, was starting to find its rhythm. Emily was in the barn, sorting tools, while Lucas hauled sacks of feed into the storage shed. A sleek black sedan rolled up the dirt road, its polished exterior gleaming like a threat. Lucas stepped out of the shed, his expression darkening as two men in suits emerged. One carried a briefcase. The other's gaze was as sharp as a blade. "Lucas Kane?" the taller man asked, his voice clipped and businesslike. Lucas nodded, his stomach tightening. "That's me." The man opened the briefcase, pulling out a stack of papers. "A foreclosure notice," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "Your father has initiated proceedings against this property. Unless the outstanding debt is paid in full within 30 days, the land will be seized." Emily appeared in the doorway of the barn, her face pale. "What? He can't do that!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with anger. "This is my family's home." The shorter man shrugged. "Legally he can, and he is." Lucas's jaw clenched, rage bubbling beneath his calm facade. "Tell my father he won't win," he said through gritted teeth. The men exchanged glances before retreating to their car. The taller one glanced back. "You can tell him yourself, Mr. Kane," he said before climbing into the sedan. The car roared to life, kicking up a cloud of dust as it sped away. Emily turned to Lucas, her eyes blazing. "Did you know about this?" she demanded. Lucas shook his head firmly. "Of course not. I told him I wouldn't let him take this place. This is his way of punishing us." Emily's voice wavered, the enormity of the situation pressing down on her. "Lucas, we can't fight him. We don't have the money, the resources, nothing." Lucas stepped closer, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within him. "We have one thing he doesn't," he said, meeting her gaze. "Us. He's underestimated what we can do together, and that's his first mistake." Emily searched his face, doubt warring with a flicker of belief. Slowly she nodded. "Then we fight. Together." Lucas placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, his grip steady despite the whirlwind around them. "We have time," he said firmly. The days that followed were grueling. Harold's retaliation extended beyond legal threats. Trucks loaded with building materials began arriving on the adjacent property, the first step in his plan to develop luxury estates that would overshadow the farm. Town gossip, no doubt stoked by Harold's influence, painted Lucas and Emily as delusional, clinging to a lost cause. But Lucas and Emily refused to back down. Lucas worked tirelessly, calling in favors, researching his father's business practices, and rallying allies. Emily, meanwhile, poured herself into the farm, her hands raw from labor as she fought to prove its worth. Together, they crafted a desperate, risky plan to expose Harold's schemes and save the farm. Yet Harold's empire wasn't built on kindness. He had crushed far stronger adversaries, and he had no intention of letting sentimentality or resistance thwart him. The farm buzzed with activity, its energy fueled by sheer willpower. Days bled into nights as Lucas and Emily pushed themselves to their limits. The strain began to show in stolen glances and quiet sighs of exhaustion. One evening, as they pored over paperwork at the kitchen table, Emily slammed a folder shut. "This is impossible," she said, her voice cracking. "No matter what we do, it feels like it's never enough." Lucas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We can't think like that," he said. "We're closer than you realize. I talked to an old friend today. She's a lawyer. She thinks there's a loophole in the foreclosure notice." Emily's eyes narrowed. "And what if there isn't? Harold has the system rigged in his favor. He's untouchable." Lucas stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "He's not untouchable," he said, stepping closer to her. "He doesn't own us, and we're not alone. I spoke to some of your neighbors today. They want to help." Emily blinked in surprise. "The neighbors?" Lucas nodded. "They remember what your family did for them when times were better. One of them even offered to lend equipment for the harvest." For the first time in days, Emily's shoulders relaxed. She looked down at the folder, then back at Lucas. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," he said, a small but confident smile tugging at his lips. "Harold thinks money is all that matters, but this farm means more to people than he'll ever understand." The next morning, a convoy of trucks and tractors arrived, kicking up clouds of dust as they pulled into the yard. Emily stood on the porch, her hands pressed to her mouth as neighbors poured out, armed with tools, supplies, and a shared determination. Old Mr. Thompson approached Lucas, his handshake firm and his eyes blazing with resolve. "Your father doesn't scare us," he said. "This land is our life, and we're not letting him take it." The community rallied, clearing overgrown fields, repairing fences, and restoring the barn. For the first time, Lucas began to see the farm not as a burden, but as a testament to resilience and potential. The connection between Lucas and Emily deepened in those moments of shared triumph. One quiet evening, as they stood under a sky peppered with stars, Emily looked at Lucas with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly, "but you did, and it's making a difference." Lucas turned to her, his voice steady. "I told you we're in this together." The day of reckoning dawned cold and clear. A sleek black SUV rolled up the driveway, its tinted windows gleaming ominously in the sunlight. Harold Kane stepped out, the sharp lines of his suit and his polished shoes absurdly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the farm. His cold gaze swept over the freshly painted barn, the cleared fields, and the neighbors still hard at work. Well, Harold said, his voice low and sardonic. You've been busy. Lucas stepped forward, standing tall beside Emily. You're not taking this farm, Dad. Harold raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. Really? And how do you plan to stop me? A few patched fences and some community spirit? The debt is still there, Lucas. Lucas's jaw tightened. We know about the loophole. Your foreclosure was based on fraudulent documents. My lawyer is preparing to file. The smirk faltered for a split second before Harold recovered. You don't have the resources to fight me in court. You're outmatched. Emily stepped forward, her voice calm but charged with emotion. You've taken enough from my family, Mr. Kane. Money might buy a lot, but it won't buy this farm. Not this time. Harold's icy gaze locked onto her. You think you can beat me? Do you know who you're dealing with? I do, Emily said firmly. A man who underestimates the strength of people who have nothing left to lose. As she spoke, the neighbors began gathering behind her and Lucas, a wall of silent defiance. Old Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his voice steady. You're not welcome here, Kane. You've taken enough from this town, and we won't let you destroy what's left. Harold scanned the crowd, his smirk replaced by a scowl. For the first time, the cracks in his confidence began to show. This wasn't a battle he could win with money alone, and the resolve in their eyes told him they wouldn't back down. Lucas met his father's gaze. You've spent your life building an empire on fear and greed. Harold's sharp gaze swept over the crowd, the smirk on his face wavering for the first time. He wasn't just facing Lucas and Emily anymore, he was facing an entire community. The weight of their silent defiance pressed against him like a tangible force. This isn't over, Harold said, his voice low and edged with anger. You're making a mistake. No, Lucas said, stepping forward. His voice was steady, unwavering. Harold's eyes lingered on his son, a flicker of disappointment mingling with something close to grudging respect. Without another word, he turned and climbed into his SUV. The sleek vehicle roared down the dirt road, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a collective exhale of relief. Lucas turned to Emily, brushing her hand with his. It's not over yet, he said quietly, a hint of resolve in his voice, but we're closer than we've ever been. Emily looked up at him, her lips curving into a soft smile. Together, we'll finish this. The weeks after Harold's retreat were marked by triumph and exhaustion. Though the immediate threat had been pushed back, Lucas and Emily knew the fight wasn't truly over. Saving the farm meant more than staving off foreclosure. It meant creating a sustainable future, something neither of them could achieve alone. Every day began before dawn. Emily tackled the fields, her hands stained with dirt and determination, while Lucas threw himself into managing the logistics of their recovery. She would often catch him in the barn with a clipboard, his brows furrowed as he juggled delivery schedules, repair plans, and financing strategies. The disinterested man who had once stumbled onto the farm had disappeared, replaced by someone driven and unrecognizably capable. One morning, Lucas approached Emily by the irrigation lines, holding out a thermos of coffee. Checking up on my work, are you? He asked with a playful grin. Emily took the thermos, raising an eyebrow as she took a sip. Let's just say I'm cautiously optimistic. You've come a long way since the chicken incident. Lucas laughed, shaking his head. She paused, her gaze softening. You didn't have to stay, she said quietly. After everything with your father, no one would have blamed you if you'd walked away. Lucas looked out over the fields, his expression contemplative. I didn't stay for anyone else, he said, turning back to her. I stayed because I wanted to, because I believe in this place and in you. Emily's cheeks flushed, her heart swelling at his words. Before she could respond, the rumble of a truck interrupted the moment. It was one of their neighbors, delivering spare equipment for the harvest. Emily waved, her gratitude spilling over once again for the community that had rallied around them. The neighbors' support became the backbone of the farm's transformation. Fields that had once been choked with weeds were now thriving with crops. Broken down structures were repaired, painted, and restored. The farm wasn't just surviving, it was becoming a symbol of what a community could achieve together. One afternoon, as Lucas repaired the barn roof, Emily called up to him. Be careful up there. If you fall, I'm not hauling you to the hospital. Let's have some fun with the readers in the comments. Type winter if you've made it this far. Now, let's get back to the story. Lucas laughed, his voice carrying over the yard. Don't worry, I've survived worse, like fixing that tractor. Emily chuckled, her pride in his growth undeniable. It's hard to believe you're the same guy who refused to get his hands dirty. People change. Lucas said, his tone earnest. "This farm, it's changed me, for the better." Together, they introduced sustainable practices, diversified their crops, and even set up a roadside stand to sell fresh produce. The farm that had once been on the brink of ruin was now a beacon of resilience. Late one evening, as they pored over financial spreadsheets, Emily let out a frustrated sigh. "It feels like we're always one step away from losing everything." Lucas reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "We've come this far," he said, his voice steady. "We're not giving up now. We'll figure it out together." Emily looked at him, her frustration melting into a grateful smile. "You always say that," she said softly. One evening, as they locked up the barn, Emily handed Lucas a worn leather journal. "This was my dad's," she said. "He documented everything about the farm, what worked, what didn't, his hopes for the future." Lucas opened the journal, his fingers tracing the neat, careful handwriting on the yellowed pages. "He must have loved this place," he said, admiration softening his voice. Emily nodded, her voice tinged with emotion. "He did, and I think he'd be proud of what we've done." Lucas looked at her, his expression sincere. "He'd be proud of you, Emily. I know I am." Her breath hitched at his words, the depth of his belief in her bringing tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood together under the fading light of the evening sky, the quiet hum of the farm surrounding them. Lucas met his father's gaze, his expression unwavering. "What now? That's up to you," he said. "You can keep pretending this is just another setback in your endless game, or you can take a hard look at the damage you've caused not just to others, but to yourself." Harold's face remained stoic, but Lucas noticed a flicker of something beneath the surface. Doubt, maybe even shame. It was a crack in the armor Harold had worn for decades. "You taught me that winning was all that mattered," Lucas continued. "But I've learned that how you win matters even more. You'll never see that unless you let go of this need to control everything and everyone." Harold leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "And what about you, Lucas? Do you think standing on that farm playing house with Emily makes you better than me?" "It doesn't make me better," Lucas said evenly. "It makes me different. I chose a path where success means building something that lasts, not tearing others down. If you can't see the value in that, then you've already lost more than you realize." For a long moment, Harold said nothing, the weight of Lucas's words hanging heavily in the air. Finally, he nodded, though whether in understanding or dismissal, Lucas couldn't tell. "Goodbye, Dad," Lucas said, turning toward the door. He paused, glancing over his shoulder one last time. "I hope someday you figure out what really matters." And with that, Lucas walked away, leaving Harold alone in his glass and steel tower, a man surrounded by the trappings of success but haunted by the cost. The field stretched out before Lucas, vibrant and thriving under the late afternoon sun. The lawsuits had been a victory not just for the farm, but for the community that had rallied behind him and Emily. Emily approached him, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You okay?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. Lucas nodded, his gaze steady on the horizon. "I went to see him." Emily didn't have to ask who. "How did it go?" Lucas shrugged. "He's still the same in a lot of ways. But maybe he's starting to realize he can't keep living like that. I don't know." Emily touched his arm, her presence grounding him. Lucas turned to her, his expression softening. "You were right, you know. Home isn't a place, it's the people you're with. And this." He gestured to the farm, the land, and the distant silhouette of the barn. Emily smiled, her eyes glistening. "For me too." The farm became a symbol of resilience and hope in the community. Lucas and Emily expanded their operations, incorporating sustainable practices that drew attention from agricultural experts and media alike. The roadside stand grew into a full-fledged farmers market, bringing local families together and revitalizing the area's economy. Lucas and Emily's partnership deepened, built on trust, shared values, and a hard-earned respect for one another. They often reflected on how far they'd come not just as individuals, but as a team. Harold Kane's empire never fully recovered from the scandal. Though he retained some of his wealth, his influence waned, and his name became a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked ambition. He rarely reached out to Lucas, but on the few occasions he did, his tone was subdued, almost reflective. Lucas never let bitterness define their relationship, though he never allowed himself to be drawn back into his father's world. One crisp autumn evening, Lucas and Emily stood together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. In the distance, the field stretched out, a patchwork of green and gold that seemed to glow in the fading light. "This place saved me," Lucas said softly. "You saved me." Emily leaned into him, her voice equally quiet. "We saved each other." And as the stars began to dot the sky, they stood side by side, the weight of their journey behind them and a future full of possibility ahead. Harold Kane sat alone in the dimly lit expanse of his penthouse, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. Once, this view had filled him with pride, kingdom of steel and glass he had built with his own hands. But now, it felt hollow. The news of his fall had spread far and wide. Lawsuits piled up, regulatory investigations loomed, and his empire, once unshakable, teetered on the edge of collapse. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, its bitter warmth doing little to soothe him. The silence was broken by the sound of the elevator. Harold glanced up, surprised to see Sarah, his daughter, step into the room. Her face, usually composed, carried an unusual intensity. "Why are you here?" Harold asked, his voice weary. "I came to tell you that I've accepted the board's offer to take over as interim CEO. Sarah said, her tone even. Harold's expression tightened. "Of course, they chose you. Another betrayal." Sarah stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "It's not betrayal, Dad. It's responsibility. The company is in shambles, and someone has to clean up the mess. I didn't create this situation, you did." Sarah continued, her gaze unwavering. "I'm taking over to save what's left, and maybe, just maybe, turn it into something worth salvaging. You taught us to fight for what we believe in. I guess now I'm fighting for a version of this company that doesn't destroy lives." Her words struck Harold like a blow, but he didn't argue. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "It's not too late, you know," Sarah said, glancing back at him. "You can still change, but you have to want to." The door closed behind her, leaving Harold alone with his thoughts. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him like an immovable force. Back at the farm, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The day of the grand reopening had finally arrived. A celebration of resilience, community, and hard-fought victories. Rows of thriving crops stood as a testament to Lucas and Emily's unwavering determination, while the barn gleamed with fresh paint, its walls adorned with decorations for the occasion. Lucas adjusted the banner hanging above the barn door, the words "Welcome to Carter Farm's Grand Reopening" proudly displayed. Nearby, Emily handed out trays of lemonade, her smile warm and inviting. "Looks like everything's coming together," Lucas said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. His hands were smudged with paint, and the faint scent of sawdust clung to him. Emily walked over, offering him a glass of lemonade. "It's perfect," she said, her eyes sparkling with pride. "And so are you, Farmer Kane." Lucas laughed, taking a sip. "Farmer Kane, huh? Who would have thought?" Emily's smile widened. "You've earned it." As the event began, the farm buzzed with life. Families wandered through the fields. Children squealed with delight at the petting zoo, and neighbors gathered around the produce stand, marveling at the fresh, vibrant offerings. The tractor-pulled hayrides drew lines of eager visitors, the laughter and chatter filling the air with joy. Lucas watched from the sidelines, his chest swelling with pride. Months ago, he had been lost adrift in his father's shadow, unsure of who he was or where he belonged. Now, surrounded by this thriving community and the farm that had become his home, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and pink, Lucas and Emily stole a quiet moment together. They stood at the edge of the orchard, the soft rustle of leaves, and the distant hum of laughter, creating a serene backdrop. "I never thought I'd feel this way about a place," Lucas admitted, his voice low. "But this farm, it's not just home, it's everything I didn't know I was missing." Emily turned to him, her expression tender. "It's not just the farm, Lucas. It's what we've built here, together." He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Emily smiled, her heart full. "And I couldn't have done it without you." As they stood side by side, the weight of their journey behind them and the promise of a bright future ahead, the farm seemed to radiate with life. It was more than a victory over Harold Kane. It was a symbol of resilience, hope, and the power of community, a legacy they had fought for and earned together. The barn was the centerpiece of the grand reopening, its transformation a testament to months of hard work and unwavering determination. Once weathered and worn, it now stood proudly as a multifunctional space for events and community gatherings. Inside, long tables were laden with the bounty of the farm, fresh fruits and vegetables, jars of homemade jams, and vibrant bouquets of wildflowers. Photographs of the farm's history adorn the walls, including one of Emily's parents standing arm in arm in front of the original barn, a poignant reminder of the legacy she was determined to honor. As visitors filled the space, admiring the displays and sampling the farm's produce, Emily paused to reflect. The journey to this day had been anything but easy. She thought of her parents and the sacrifices they had made, the nights spent wondering if it was time to let go, and the moments when hope seemed impossibly distant. But standing here now, surrounded by laughter and life, she knew it had all been worth it. Midway through the event, Lucas climbed onto a makeshift stage, his nerves evident as he adjusted the microphone. The crowd stilled, their attention drawn to the man who had become an integral part of their community. "Thank you all for being here today," Lucas began, his voice strong despite a hint of emotion. "This farm has always been more than just a piece of land. It's a symbol of resilience, hard work, and community. Today, it stands stronger than ever because of all of you." He paused, his gaze finding Emily near the front of the crowd. "But this farm and all of you taught me the value of perseverance, of home, and of belonging. For that, I'll always be grateful." Applause erupted, filling the barn with the sound of shared triumph. Emily's chest swelled with pride as she watched Lucas, a man who had once felt like an outsider, embrace his role as part of their community. As the sun began its descent, the celebration shifted into full swing. A local band played lively tunes near the barn, their music drawing couples to a makeshift dance floor while children laughed and played tag in the open fields. The scent of fresh-baked pies mingled with the crisp autumn air, creating a warmth that seemed to envelop the entire farm. Emily found herself surrounded by neighbors near the produce stand. They marveled at the fruits and vegetables on display, their words brimming with admiration. "Your parents would have been so proud, Emily," Mrs. Thompson said, her eyes glistening. "They always believed this farm could be something special." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I just hope we're honoring their legacy." Mrs. Thompson patted her arm, her expression warm. "You're doing more than that, dear. You're building something even they couldn't have imagined." Across the field, Lucas was deep in conversation with a group of farmers. They were animatedly discussing sustainable practices, a topic Lucas had become passionate about. One of the older farmers clapped him on the back, a wide grin on his face. "You've got a knack for this, Lucas," the man said. "Not bad for a city boy." Lucas laughed, his humility shining through. "I've had the best teacher," he replied, glancing toward Emily. The farmers chuckled, but the respect in their eyes was unmistakable. Lucas had earned his place among them, not through words alone, but through hard work and a genuine desire to contribute. As dusk fell, the crowd gathered near the orchard for the evening's final event, a lantern release. The hum of anticipation filled the air, and Lucas and Emily stood together at the center of the circle. Emily took the microphone, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overcome her. "This farm has faced its share of challenges," she began, "but it has also been a place of hope, resilience, and love. Tonight, as we release these lanterns, I want us all to think about what we're letting go of and what we're making space for." Lucas stepped forward, holding his lantern. "This farm isn't just about us," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "It's about all of you. It's about a community that refused to give up. This farm wouldn't be here without your belief in what it could be." Together, they lit their lanterns, the flames flickering softly against the night. One by one, the lanterns rose into the sky, their golden light scattering across the darkness. The crowd watched in awe as the glowing orbs floated higher, a breathtaking symbol of renewal and possibility. The next morning, the farm lay quiet under the first rays of sunlight. Emily stood on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. The echoes of laughter and music from the night before still lingered in her mind, filling her with a profound sense of peace and gratitude. Lucas joined her, his hair tousled from sleep and a soft smile on his face. "Couldn't stay in bed?" Emily shook her head, her gaze sweeping over the fields. Lucas stepped closer, the warmth of his presence grounding her. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice soft, "and we're just getting started." Emily turned to him, her eyes shining. As the sun climbed higher, The farm seemed to glow with life, the promise of a bright future stretching out before them. Together they stood, knowing that this was more than just a farm, it was home. And it always would be. Lucas emerged from the house, his hair tousled from sleep, a steaming mug in hand. He leaned against the porch railing, his gaze sweeping over the fields bathed in the soft morning light. "Quiet morning," he said, his voice calm. Emily nodded, her eyes following the gentle sway of the crops in the breeze. "After everything, it feels surreal." Lucas took a sip of his coffee, a small smile playing on his lips. It's the calm after the storm. The farm had reached a turning point, but both of them knew the work wasn't done. The weeks that followed were filled with long days and careful planning. The lawsuit settlement gave them the resources to invest in improvements they had only dreamed of. New equipment arrived, solar panels were installed, and Emily expanded the garden into a thriving greenhouse. Lucas used his business acumen to secure partnerships with local markets and restaurants, ensuring the farm's future profitability. One afternoon, Emily sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sifting through a box of old photographs she had found in the attic. Each image told a story of her family's connection to the land, her parents standing in front of the barn, a young Emily holding her first basket of vegetables, the fields in full bloom. At the bottom of the box, she uncovered a handwritten note from her father. "This land holds more than crops, it holds dreams. I hope you'll always remember that." The words filled her with a mix of nostalgia and determination. She carried the note downstairs and showed it to Lucas, who read it carefully. "Your dad was a wise man," Lucas said, his tone thoughtful. "And he was right." Emily nodded, her voice steady. "I want to honor his dreams, but I also want to build something new, something that's ours." Lucas's smile was warm and encouraging. "Then let's do it together." As the seasons changed, so did the farm. What had once been a struggling patch of land was now a thriving oasis of growth and possibility. Emily and Lucas, too, had transformed not just as farmers, but as partners. Their mutual respect and admiration deepened into something neither had dared to name: love. One evening, they sat on the porch, the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Lucas turned to Emily, his voice quiet. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Emily tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've come so far, but I feel like we're just getting started. This farm is our foundation, but there's so much more we could do." A spark lit in Emily's eyes. "Like what?" Lucas hesitated, then grinned. "A bed and breakfast, maybe. Or a community education program teaching people about sustainable farming." Emily laughed softly. "You've turned into a dreamer, Lucas Kane." "Maybe I have," he said, his grin widening. "But only because I've learned to dream with you. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type coffee if you've made it this far. Only those who made it will understand. Now, let's continue with the story." One snowy winter evening, Lucas led Emily to the barn, which he had transformed into a cozy haven. Twinkling lights hung from the rafters, and a small fire crackled in a portable stove. On a table near the center, blueprints and sketches were laid out. "What's this?" Emily asked, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I've been working on an idea," Lucas said, gesturing to the plans. "We could use it to teach sustainable farming, host workshops, maybe even bring in schools for field trips." Emily studied the drawings, her excitement growing. "Lucas, this is amazing. It's just the start," he said, his voice humble. Emily looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I know we can." By late spring, the Learning Center was no longer just a dream. A small ceremony marked the groundbreaking, attended by friends, neighbors, and reporters who had followed Lucas and Emily's journey. They stood side by side, shovels in hand, as they posed for photos and spoke about their vision. "This isn't just a building," Emily said, addressing the crowd. "It's a place where we can share what we've learned, inspire others, and build connections. It's a symbol of what's possible when people come together." Lucas followed, his voice steady with conviction. "I used to think success was about climbing the corporate ladder, but real success is about making a difference. This farm, this community's shown me what that looks like." As summer arrived, the farm hummed with life. The Learning Center took shape near the orchard, its foundation strong and its purpose clear. Emily and Lucas worked tirelessly, balancing the demands of the farm with their growing vision for the center. The community rallied behind them, offering support and resources. One afternoon, as they cleared a patch of land for a new crop, Lucas paused to take in the bustling scene around him. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked Emily. All the time, she replied, leaning on her shovel. But it's not just about where we've been, it's about where we're going. Lucas smiled. You're starting to sound like me, Emily laughed. Maybe you're rubbing off on me. As they returned to work, Lucas's heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, not just on the farm, but with Emily. When the Learning Center officially opened, it marked another milestone in their journey. Families gathered to tour the facility, participate in workshops, and learn about sustainable practices. The farm, once a symbol of struggle, had become a beacon of hope and innovation. Emily and Lucas stood together near the entrance, watching as visitors explored the center. Lucas reached for Emily's hand, his grip firm yet gentle. Emily squeezed his hand, her voice filled with emotion. No, we're just getting started. And as the sun set over the thriving fields, they knew their journey, though far from over, had already transformed not only their lives, but the lives of everyone around them. Together, they had built something extraordinary, a legacy rooted in love, resilience, and the belief that anything is possible when people come together. As the Learning Center took shape, so did the future Lucas and Emily were building together. Their days were filled with planning workshops to teach sustainable farming, programs for local schools, and community events that would keep the farm buzzing with life. But in the evenings, they set aside time to just be. These quieter moments were a reminder of the journey they had taken and the bond they had forged. One such evening, they sat side by side on the porch, the fields before them bathed in the golden light of dusk. Fireflies blinked and flickered in the growing darkness, their soft glow dancing across the landscape. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and freshly tilled earth. Lucas broke the silence, his voice low. Do you ever regret it? He asked, turning to Emily. His expression was thoughtful, tinged with vulnerability. Any of it? Emily shook her head slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon before meeting his. Not for a second, she said with quiet conviction. This farm, this life, it's everything I ever dreamed of. Her words hung in the air, soft and true. Lucas felt his chest tighten with emotion, the weight of her sincerity settling in his heart. He reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers. I feel the same way, he said, his voice steady but full of feeling. I came here thinking I didn't belong, that this life wasn't meant for me. But now, I can't imagine being anywhere else, not without you. Emily smiled, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. We've come a long way, haven't we? Lucas chuckled softly. More than I ever thought possible. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fireflies dance and the first stars begin to appear in the indigo sky. The farm stretched out before them, vibrant and a livelier testament to their shared effort, their community's support, and the dreams they had dared to pursue. It wasn't just a farm anymore, it was home. And as they sat together, hand in hand, they knew their journey, though still unfolding, had already given them everything they could ever need: purpose, partnership, and the kind of love that grows strong and steady, like roots sinking deep into the earth. What do you think? Was Lucas's transformation genuine, or did Emily's resilience play the key role in his change? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you were in Emily's shoes, would you have trusted Lucas after everything? Don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. How much did you enjoy it? Make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to stay updated with all our stories. And don't miss out on more inspiring tales. Click here on the end screen to watch more.